Terry.
All right. Kevin, thank you for the presentation. I know you're an attorney, but I'm going to ask you a couple of chemical engineering questions.
I'll do my best.
Do the best you can. So you mentioned you focused a lot on air pollution in your presentation. Do you know how the amount of air pollution generated by a process like this would depend on the purity of the feedstock? You mentioned it a little bit.
So it depends not so much on the purity of the feedstock, but what is the feedstock? Because different feedstocks bring with them different concerns. So especially, we could be talking about a pure feedstock in the sense that it's only plastic. But if we're gasifying only plastic, that comes with its own concerns. Again, treating plastics with high heat is a proven recipe to generate dioxins. PVC plastic, for example, when we reduce that into any type of hydrocarbon fuel, you're going to generate lead and mercury and also hydrochlorides. So any type of fuel kind of brings with it its own sets of emissions. I'm aware of those for plastics. When it comes to some of the other elements of feedstock like organic waste and paper, I'm not as well versed in what types of air pollutants those can generate. But I'd be happy to look into it with you.
And you also mentioned a wide range of temperatures, that these facilities can operate from anywhere between 800 degrees Fahrenheit and 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, both very hot, but different degrees of hot. Do you know how sensitive the amount of pollution that's generated is to the operating temperature in the unit?
So that's a bit of a tough question to answer because I think that any particular, there's such a wide range in the technologies that any particular unit is in all likelihood going to be best suited to a particular temperature range. And if it happens to operate outside that temperature range, that's often when you run into certain pollutant concerns, particularly with things like dioxins. If you're operating outside your ideal range, you can bump up your dioxin formulation. But I don't think that there's, if you look at the low end or the high end, I'm unaware that there is kind of a preferred place on the spectrum.
I think I've read that a lot of those compounds that you mentioned are sometimes referred to as products of incomplete combustion. Mm-hmm. And that's why sometimes that temperature range becomes critical. So it was kind of a setup question. Sorry. Thank you. I'm all set.
Thank you, Terry. Kevin, I have a question. If we would eliminate all the plastic in our life right now, end plastic use, how long would it take to get rid of the plastic that already exists? Do you have an answer on that?
I do not have an answer on that. And just as a point of clarification, I certainly wouldn't advocate for getting rid of all of the plastics in our lives because there are certain durable plastics that are highly advantageous if we're talking about durable medical equipment or some of the plastics that are in our vehicles that make them lighter. But most of what we're throwing out is single-use plastics, and that's what we're looking to eliminate. And so if we step in, take action to restrict particular kinds of single-use plastics, we can significantly cut down on their use on the order of years, certainly.
Thank you. Any other questions? Certainly, Chris.
Thank you for the presentation. Do any states in New England or Mid-Atlantic consider this type of technology, whether it's the projects proposed or discussed today or just broadly, as a renewable energy resource in New England or the Mid-Atlantic, or is this not considered a renewable energy resource in those respective states?
So off the top of my head, I do not know how gasification and pyrolysis are classified in other states. I do know that currently both Connecticut and Massachusetts classify municipal solid waste incineration as renewable energy, which is not something that Conservation Law Foundation agrees with. Mm-hmm.
Senator Sinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation, Kevin. I just, I had a few questions on the examples that you gave in your presentation of the landscape of failures. I'm using your term. A two-part question. I know there are probably different types of plants. I mean, you had one was a biomass and one was plasma gasification. But anyway, I'm interested because one was in Scotland, one was in Canada, two in Scotland, I'm sorry, Germany, and then one in Australia, the examples that you gave us. And I'm wondering if you know what they have done in these countries because of the materials that were heading to these facilities to be burnt, or I'm trying to use the proper term that you have used here, converted into energy. Do you know what they're doing now? Have they gone to more recycling? Have they banned certain products? Or are there different plants that have started up in these countries to take care of these feedstock issues?
Sure. As far as I know, when these facilities have failed, the feedstock that they otherwise would have been using has kind of gone into the existing waste stream. What any of these particular localities do they landfill? Do they incinerate their municipal solid waste? I'm not aware of that. I will say that particularly if we're talking about Scotland and other locations in Europe, they are significantly ahead of the U.S. in terms of their recycling rates and their restrictions on single-use plastics. Particularly, Scotland has a robust bottle bill program, a bottle return program, and also kind of producer responsibility programs there. So they tend to have lower amounts of plastic waste in their waste stream at present. But that's kind of a generalization. In terms of kind of what they pivoted to when any one of these particular facilities closed, I do not have that information on hand.
Okay. So in other words, you're saying that for Scotland, for instance, that they reduced the use of plastics a lot of, I'll say they reduced their plastic appetite. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, they've done a better job at reducing their plastic appetite so far than we have in the U.S. and here in Rhode Island. I'm confident that we can catch up rather quickly.
Okay. I would be interested, though, if you had any. I know you do a lot of research on these issues. If you had any more information about if there's any other plants that had started up in Scotland at all, or if they just abandoned that altogether, that idea of gasification or incineration. Is that possible for you to give us any more information?
Yeah, it's not information that I have at the tip of my fingers right now, but I would be happy to look into it and get you any information on that.
Even if you send us in a direction where we can find it, that would
Certainly.
be very helpful.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Other questions?
Thank you, Mr. Boudris. Quick question. So in listening to your presentation and going to zero waste, I started to think of what we do in Rhode Island as far as manufacturing. So we have a series of companies that produce plastic machines that receive at the very beginning the raw material. It could be plastic pellets. They extrude that byproduct or that product, and by doing that, they're heating. So they're melting that plastic. As it's going through the machine, it's going through a mold, which is going to generate whatever physical plastic you're looking to generate, whether it be medical related or a simple K-cup at the end of the line. And I started thinking about, that process we understand very well. There are several good Rhode Island manufacturers that produce these machines. They're called plastic extruding machines, and they sell them worldwide. Are you aware of anyone that has done research or may have done prototype development or pilot projects by which they're taking recycled plastics and running it through an extruded machine to recycle the very product and reuse that product into something else?
I will freely admit that plastic extruding machines aren't something that I've done research on, so I'm not certain what if there's a difference between, using virgin plastic in those machines or post-consumer plastic in those machines. I'm unaware of the impacts of that.
Thank you.
I would like to recognize John Rendu. He was a few minutes late, representing the Rhode Island Commerce Department. Thank you very much. John, I believe Torrey Plastic does do that in their facility, and I believe they will be making a presentation at our next meeting. So it may be a question for them, but I'm pretty sure they do that.
The recycling.
Yes, they do.
Great, thank you.
Joe?
Kevin, thanks for your presentation here. Just a question. So, I represent the landfill, which I'm sure you're well aware of, and we are, our life expectancy, depending how you calculate it, is perhaps 10 to 15 years. And I'm curious in terms of going on a plastics diet, and look, I'm quite sensitive to that as well, given, the downstream that we see. What I'm also sensitive to is the rationale on how you go on this plastics diet. How do you get upstream? So I guess my question is two parts. One is talk about some of those efforts and the effectiveness of taking some of this jerky bags and plastic lids and things out of the waste stream, right? That's rather daunting, rather surgical. Means I believe it means a significant amount of uphill effort with the producers. So I'm curious on where we are with that. And again, I'm considering this in context of the life we have left, right? So, something that works a decade from now is a little late for us, but still meaningful. And second, if the feedstock for these types of facilities, I believe, is limited in terms of that type of material, talk about the other feedstock products, which really are the industrial and commercial sectors that'll provide a significant volume to these facilities. How would that plastics diet, how does that curbing of that work? Where is this material and who are the players and how do you curb that? Because to me, that's a pretty significant amount of volume that we're talking about here in terms of these facilities and acquiring tonnage to manufacture.
Sure. If I may just ask a clarifying question on your second question. Were you referring to the plastics that are in construction and demolition debris?
No, I suspect, and we heard this earlier, that the material that feeds these facilities, perhaps can come out of these pilot programs, these hefty energy bags and R-Flex bales and things. That's, I suspect, quite limited. A fair amount of this material is going to come out of the commercial industrial side of the equation, right?
Sure.
Offcuts, extruded scrap, really pre-consumer material that hasn't hit the market. And that to me would be a more important feature in order to curtail that, especially given the percentage of the volume we're talking about here. On the post-consumer time side would be quite limited. So I really want to understand how you curb that appetite. How do you work with these industrial players that need a home for this material that perhaps this could provide and curb their use? Is it they're curbing their use of it, or do they already have alternatives to take this material to and such?
Sure. I think that one of the best routes to getting at both of these problems, both on the consumer side and on the commercial side, are extended producer responsibility programs, which I'd mentioned earlier, where you create financial incentives, whether it's for a company that's producing packaging that ends up going to a consumer, or if it's for a commercial entity that's creating, a certain amount of waste product, particularly plastic, in its process. You create the financial incentives to encourage them to adopt better practices, use better materials to kind of cut these types of wastes out. Again, be they pre-consumer or post-consumer. And we are involved in a variety of efforts in the U.S. right now to try to adopt some extended producer responsibility programs that pertain more directly to plastics and plastic packaging. But other places have had success with them, both in Europe and in British Columbia has done well with its extended producer responsibility for packaging. And it makes a significant and very short-term impact on what's in their waste stream. So if implemented correctly, those can reduce these types of wastes significantly, again, in 2-3 years. So being very sensitive to the fact that the landfill's got maybe only 15 years left, these could have an impact within that time frame, particularly when coupled with other types of diversionary tactics, particularly the food waste restrictions on diverting more to composting and aerobic digestion, which will save time right away.
Okay. Thank you.
Kevin, I want to thank you very much for your presentation. I also want to thank Craig Cookson for his presentation. Also, the members of this commission, thank you for your time. Our attorney, Pat Breslin, thank you for all your work that you do for us. Everybody in the audience, thank you for being here. Our next meeting will be sometime in April. Pat will get an email out to you with hopefully 2 weeks' notice before that happens. And I believe one of our presentations is going to be from Torrey Plastics at that time. I have a motion to adjourn. So moved.